Hello and welcome to Oh Happy Clay. My name is Jenny Hansen and I'm going to guide you through reclaiming clay. Reclaiming clay is a very important skill to have as an art educator, especially if you're using clay in the classroom, because clay, after you're done using it and you haven't fired it, takes up a lot of space. It also costs money to continue buying new bags of clay. Most of you probably get your clay from a clay supplier. You're going to get something that looks like this in a 25-pound bag. The ideal situation would be that you would always have a good consistent clay body to give to your students. This clay is going to be a wonderful consistency, easy to form and move, and it's hydrated and it feels wonderful and students will love this. But what's going to happen over time is that that wonderful clay is going to dry out and it's going to become hard, maybe leather hard, even harder, and then it's going to become bone dry. What you do with that as an educator is very important. It's going to save money and it's going to save space. Different people have different ways of reclaiming clay, and I am going to show you one of the ways that I think would be most effective in a classroom that doesn't have much space. So what happens is you have this buildup of dry clay, not usable, and you can't form it anymore. And what I recommend is getting a bucket, a trash can, or small containers if you're going to have each student do it for themselves that you provide in the classroom. And if it's a big container, I recommend that you have this on wheels so that you can move this to different locations easily. So you're going to collect your clay in the container, and what's going to happen is you're going to take your water and you're going to dump it in, and you're going to leave at least an inch or two over the top. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to just have your bucket and always have your layer of water, and then students, after they have waste, can simply add that into the bucket. So what that is going to look like after you leave that for some time is this clay right here, which is reconstituted. And now we have a slurry. It might seem similar to slip, and I like to kind of just move in here and break up the chunks if I have chunks. It's much safer to break up the chunks while the clay is wet than it is when it's dry. So it's really important that if you have dry clay that you add that water and you let it absorb into the clay body. The supplies needed for reclaiming clay are rather simple. You only need a few things. The first thing that I talked about earlier is that you need a bucket or a container that can hold the clay before you've begun the process. And then second, but most important, is that you're going to need a surface to absorb the water out of the clay body after you've reconstituted it. This surface that I'm working on is a Hardie backer board, which I highly recommend. And people also work on plaster quite often, but if you're trying to have a plaster-free classroom, then I highly recommend this Hardie backer board. And then you also need a putty knife of some sort. This isn't sharp, it's just simply used to remove the clay from the surface of the board. The amount of time that you leave the clay in the reclaim bucket is going to be dependent on how hard or soft that clay was. The harder the clay, the bone dry clay, is actually going to reconstitute quite a bit faster. So you're just going to have to check it, and you're going to have to feel your hand in there, and you're going to have to see if it's ready or not. So what we're going to do to start the reclaim process is we're going to get our container near our board or our plaster board. Okay, so if it's big, make sure it's on wheels. If it's small and you're having students do this on an individual level and they have their small containers, it's pretty easy. If you have a dedicated ceramic space, I would just keep your reclaim bucket next to your surface that's going to be used for reclaim. So what you're going to do is work your way around inside the container, and I just drip that water off so that I make the smallest amount of mess possible. And you're going to go ahead and lay the clay out onto the board, and I would say, half an inch, maybe even too thick. And what is going to happen is the water is going to absorb out of this clay, and we're going to be able to wedge this back up, and you will not know the difference between the clay that you got out of the bag and this clay. Some important things to think about are that dependent on where you live, your climate, the air, all of those things, this is going to dry up at a different speed. So I can't give you an exact estimate, but what I would say is that give yourself a half an hour, dependent how thick you lay this down. If it's really thin, you might only want to wait 10 minutes. And then you're going to go ahead and come back, and you're going to check on your clay to make sure that it's doing what you want it to do. And I've already started a sheet over here. And so what you're going to do when you come back to it is you're going to scoop it up on your putty knife, and you're actually going to flip that over. And after that sits for a pretty short time, definitely shorter than you originally did, you should be able to wedge that up. What you're going to do is you're going to place your clay and you're going to push it and pull it back. I wedge in a spiral form, and you don't have to do that. There's also a way called ram's head that I've seen, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach a few other videos. There are a lot of people that have put videos up about how to wedge, and you can decide what way works best for you and for your students. The goal of wedging is to get all of the air bubbles out, so you do want to have a wire tool for this part of the process, and you want to cut it in half. And you really want to see that there's no air pockets in here, and if there are, then you know you need to continue to wedge this for some time. But really, I think your students will have a hard time knowing the difference between these two bodies if you could feel them.